Welcome to an episode of the Courtney Turner Podcast. This is a very special episode. It is a part of the Cognitive Liberty series, and this is Cognitive Liberty to Resist Technocracy. And we have an incredible panel of guests who are joining us. This is going to be with Patrick Wood, who has been studying technocracy for literally decades. He is the living expert on technocracy. And then, of course, we have David Hughes, who has just done his Omni-War series, which is phenomenal. You should definitely check that out. And he's written several books on this topics. And we also have Ian Davis, who has written a whole series on this topic. And we've had him on the show. We've had all of them on the show before. So this is, I think, one of the most important topics, really, right now, of what we're facing. You know, I always talk about the desire to preserve the free will of humanity, because when they say that they want to create humanity 2.0, they mean it. And by humanity 2.0, I think that unfortunately will take a very different shape, form than humanity 1.0. And I unfortunately think that means the potential of the eradication of the free will of humanity. If technocracy and transhumanism are to be realized in the fashion that they seem to envision, then the free will of humanity is in jeopardy. And so, therefore, this is really one of the most important topics to resist in order to preserve the free will of humanity. They all have so much knowledge, and what I really tried to do in this episode was to be able to bring out because all of their knowledge is, they have a lot of overlap, but there's also, very unique things that each of them has expertise in. And I really wanted to try to bring that forth to, highlight their expertise, to bring that information to you. So we go through many different facets of technocracy through the history, how it relates to the potential of transhumanism. Of course, things like the biodigital convergence come up as well, and the various philosophies that are underpinning these movements and where it is that they're leading. So I hope you enjoy this. I hope you learn a lot. And mostly I aim to inform, inspire, and empower you to exercise your free will, because that, to me, is the bulwark against their goals. And I do think technocracy would be like, if it is realized, would be unlike any kind of tyranny that we could even fathom. Way worse than communism, fascism. Not that those aren't both horrific and haven't led to, tremendous atrocities throughout history. But I think that technocracy, if realized, would be truly just a hellscape, a prison for humanity. So I'm hoping that you learn a tremendous amount, and that you embrace your non-compliance and resist technocracy. Without further ado, let's bring on our guests. How are all of you gentlemen doing today?
Thanks. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to have all of you in the same space and to cover what I think is probably one of the most important topics of our time in preserving the cognitive liberty and the free will of humanity. I think raising awareness is the first step to being able to resist it. And I know some people think it's imminent and it's unavoidable, but I do think that we do have free will still, and hopefully we can do our best to at least derail it and slow it down, and if not, push it back altogether. So without further ado, let's just do a brief introduction on who you are, your background, how you got into this topic of technocracy. And let's start with you, Patrick, since you've been working on this for decades. So
exactly. My shortest introduction is I'm the guy that's the living expert on technocracy. That was coined by who was it? Somebody, a podcaster in South Africa, actually. But I am the expert in the field at this point, and I wish I weren't, but that's the way it is. And I've been studying globalization ever since late 1970s.
Wow. And what was your first foray into it that you realized this was something that needed to have all of your time and energy devoted to?
You bet. When I saw the Trilateral Commission taking over the U.S. government, I was totally alarmed and activated at that point too. It was a huge story. It was never told properly back in that day, except for the work that we did with our books, 2 volumes set, Trilaterals over Washington. And the rest is history. You know, we were censored back in that day, and we were crushed by the machine. And so I know what it's like to have censorship put on. I'm used to it almost, but not really. You never get used to it. But it was totally egregious at that time.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. So, David Hughes, how about you? How did you get into this?
Well, last year I published a book called COVID-19 Psychological Operations and the War for Technocracy. And in chapter 1 of that book, I stand on the shoulders of giants, including these 2 gentlemen here today. And I understood through extensive research that the transnational ruling class was seeking to do away with existing control paradigms and to introduce something new, biodigital, and altogether much worse. And it was firstly through Patrick's work on Technocracy that I was able to put a name to this. But Ian had also written some great stuff on Technocracy, and so had James Corbett. And those are the 3 primary sources that I draw on in the section on Technocracy in chapter 1.
Awesome. And you, Ian?
I came into it because I read Patrick's work. Patrick's books, I found, were absolutely vital in expanding my understanding of technocracy. And then I subsequently wrote a book in 2021, Pseudo Pandemic: The New Normal Technocracy. And very much like David, I was seeing. I think the key thing is that the things that were predicted by Patrick and people like Anthony C. Sutton were happening. You could see them happening. You could see this, for example, the move towards a scientific viewpoint of development. That's been growing, and it was evident to me that this was, and it was evident to me from when I first read Patrick's work, and then subsequently reading the work of people like David, that this is the most pressing socio-political challenge that we've faced to date, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that statement. So we were talking before we pressed record about how sometimes we need to back up with some definitions for people. Not everybody is as steeped in this material as the 3 of you. So let's start with just a brief overview of what is technocracy and why does it matter? Why should we be so concerned? Why is this such a pressing socio-political issue currently? Who wants to start? Patrick,
Start.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Originally, technocracy was defined as the science of social engineering. That's scary because that's how we see this all over the place right now. The science of social engineering, basically as an economic system that was coined in the 1930s. It was a resource-based economic system, not based on supply and demand. Everybody understands supply and demand. That's how we get our pricing system. That's how we get the exchange of money, et cetera. They wanted to do away with everything that we had before that in history, and they wanted to rule it simply by fiat, by scientific algorithm, if you will. And these were top scientists and engineers at Columbia University, no less. This was not just a bunch of pikers that got together and figured out, hey, this is what we're going to do. No, these people were educated to the max, and they thought they were doing great thing, I think, because the Great Depression was really ugly and messy. But out of that came this crackpot idea of technocracy, ruled by experts. And even at that point, they said, we need to get rid of all the politicians. That's the first step. And turn everything over to them, the scientists and engineers, to run all of society, all of the economic mechanisms. And the reason that they wanted to get rid of all the politicians was basically they would just substitute for that entity, and they were convinced wrongly that there was no need for public discussion because they had the science. They were sure that they would provide all of the right answers for society. You don't need to discuss this. So what do you need politicians for? That's what politicians do, discuss stuff. Well, we see this antipathy today moving, almost 100 years from that point of time, the antipathy between the technocratic class and the political class. It's all over the place. If you're not looking for it, you might not see it, but I see it all the time, where little things slip out of the mouth of the technocrats, denigrating politicians of one sort or another. You could just see the hostility still there, and it is still there.
For sure. Yeah. Ian, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think what they propose as well. I mean, if you look at the dictionary definition of technocracy, it just says that it's just a system of government led by technocrats, scientists, experts leading policy decision making. But the 1930s Technocrat and the Technocracy Inc. was the name of the movement. They proposed, as Patrick was discussing there, a total system of social control. In fact, they've had this very mechanistic, scientific, engineering-based approach to everything. So things like the word society, they changed. So in their minds, it wasn't society; it was the social mechanism. And they decided that they could split what they call the functions of society. So you would take each, today we might call them different sectors or different aspects of policy making, such as foreign policy, or different sectors of the economy, such as, the manufacturing sector or whatever. They would split society into these functions, and that would enable them to, using the scientific approach and the engineering-based approach, that would enable them to technically engineer the function. They called it a sequence of functions. They broke society, or what they called the social mechanism, into a sequence of functions. So they've got this very rigid, mechanistic thinking about how the world that we live in can be managed almost like a kind of computer program, that this kind of algorithmic sense that you could, everything can be controlled by this dispassionate, logical, algorithmic machine. At the same time, they also proposed a hierarchical structure, and I would say that, I'm echoing something that Patrick said. If you look at what people like Scott, who was one of the original founders of Technocracy Inc., they were in their own way trying to fix something that they thought was broken. And I think that they, it's kind of in a kind of naive way, they had this notion that they could provide what they called an economy of abundance. That it would be a classless structure that would be better for everybody, and so they, in a sense, they had altruistic kind of motivations. But the people that were backing them at the time, the people like the oligarchs of the day, the Rockefellers particularly, they could see that what they were creating was this incredibly rigid hierarchical control system. So from their perspective, This is just brilliant. This is they couldn't. I think that they couldn't believe their luck.
Mhm.
So they, even though technocracy with its proposals to change the entire kind of monetary system, to roll out these things called energy certificates, and the kind of bureaucracy that they were suggesting at the time was technologically and practically unworkable. But the people that were backing it, the people that could see the potential of it, that specifically, as Patrick would later go on to write about, the Trilateral Commission and the people around the people around the Carter administration, Brzezinski and people like that, they could see the potential for technocracy if and when the technology was ready to really put that system in place. And I think that's the real key issue that people need to understand when they look at technocracy. It is now, technologically speaking, it is very feasible. And more than that, they are putting it into place. They are putting that system into place.
Yeah, absolutely. David, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, Patrick and Ian have covered most of the key points. One word which hasn't come up so far is totalitarianism. I would say that in the original formation of technocracy, they were responding to the Great Depression and the crisis of capitalism and looking for an alternative. But over time, that idea has increasingly morphed into something totalitarian. So even in the mid-20th century, when you look at the writings of Aldous Huxley and Bertrand Russell and others, Brzezinski, they're talking about a scientific dictatorship. So they've clearly picked up on the potential here for centralized total control through scientific means, and particularly owing to Rockefeller influence and inward investment into China, actually, in terms of R&D particularly, to try and develop these technologies. It's no surprise that China then emerged as what Ian has called the world's first technate. So there's that to consider. There's also the dehumanizing element to it, because when you think of human beings as mere cogs in a machine, just parts of a control system, nations come on to some of that later on. And yeah, just finally, in terms of the technologies, this technocracy is all about being able to monitor everyone and everything all the time. And back in the 1930s, that would have seemed a complete pipe dream, completely impossible. But you only have to think about the word smart these days. And you see very quickly that all of us are, in fact, being monitored in all kinds of ways all the time. And this increasing harvesting of data, which is flowing to companies like Peter Thiel's Palantir, is a very dangerous thing from the perspective of the public, because it's increasingly centralizing control in the hands of the technocrats.
Absolutely. So that will lead me into my next question. I had kind of opened with this. What is transhumanism, and how does it relate to technocracy? Is this is it part of technocracy? Maybe David, do you want to take that one?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so Dan Brody and Lissa Johnson and I have written quite extensively on transhumanism, and we don't think that there's a simple definition to it. Yeah, so transhumanism means different things to different people, but the connection to technocracy, I think, is fairly clear when you consider that technocracy treats, in its ultimate formulation, it treats human beings as nodes on a control system. And so ideally, from their perspective, that actually involves the re-engineering of humanity itself. And so it actually takes us to some pretty uncomfortable places, because this is actually an attack on the very essence of humanity, and it assumes all kinds of different forms. We've talked in our work, well, that's Dan Brody and Lisa Johnson and I have talked in our work, for example, about the Internet of Bio-Nano Things as one potential means of achieving this.
Mhm.
But when you consider projects like Starlink and the attempt to bathe the world in EMF, this is pretty scary stuff. Now, some of these technologies, we've argued in our recent symposium on the brain, may still be in incubation, some of the more exotic sounding ones, but it's pretty clear what they're trying to do. And they've thrown massive amounts of funding at nanotechnologies and brain research technologies over the last 20 years or so. So we really need to be on our guard here, because this train is coming down the tracks extremely fast. And I think that the public is not as aware of this as it should be.
For sure.
Yeah. In the 1980s, and at least the 1990s, transhumanism was basically just an esoteric exercise blowing smoke. They didn't have anything to hang their hat on scientifically, although there was talk about stuff, but no evidence. When convergent science was invented in circa 2000, it proposed the merger of 4 disciplines of science into one discipline called NBIC, that was nanotechnology, information technology, biotechnology, and cognitive science. That set the stage at that point for the merger of technocracy and transhumanism, because they were both based on the same body of science. And they found support for that combination, for instance, at the World Economic Forum, where Klaus Schwab incessantly talked about the merger of humans into something like humans 2.0. Then he talked about the Great Reset, this reset society into something other than what it was. Well, technocracy was intended to reform society. But what's the point of making a great reset just to pour the same old people in this new system? In their mind, they just wrecked it again. So you need a new form of humanity to populate this reset world. And it's turned out pretty ugly, especially with the COVID debacle. But this seems to be the plan, and has been expressed openly by Klaus Schwab, for instance, and other people at the World Economic Forum. That's the plan. Reset society, and then reset humanity to inhabit that society.
Yeah, there's a foundation. It's a Humanity 2.0 foundation. They're working with Harvard, and Harvard's doing the Human Flourishing Project with this Humanity 2.0 foundation. So again, this is where, we need a separate glossary, because typically I'm pretty sure their idea of human flourishing is not quite the same as mine, at least. I won't speak for anybody else, but I think we might have a different idea. But this is, I'd like to give you an opportunity, and if you have anything to add to that. But then I do want to get into this, because what I'm noticing, we started talking about this a little bit before we press record, but I'm seeing on both sides, there is this, they're using kind of these spiritual, philosophical, religious movements as an underpinning. I think, it's kind of a cybernetic feedback loop, if you will, to use some of their terms. But I think it is in some sense, they're using it to advance their agenda and justify their agenda. But I think they're also using it to steer it. Because, I'll make this a little bit more concrete for people, but But for example, the World Economic Forum, which partnered with the UN in 2019, is kind of the tactical arm. The UN, who is trying to, at least from what I can see, foment this one world religion, and it looks like it's a theosophical soup type of religion. That's what I would call it. But I think it's very intentional in order to steer people into the oneness. So if people believe, and I see it as two camps. So there are the people who believe that we already are part of the one, that very Neoplatonic kind of concept with the Theosophists have rebranded as source. But it's all very similar kind of a concept that we come from the one and we have to return to the one. So there's that, and then there's the other kind of more pragmatic, mechanistic concept, which I would say the current technocrats, the neo-reactionary movement, are more top-down approach, where they're saying that we're going to create the one through the singularity. But either way, we end up in the noosphere. And the joke I kind of make, and it may not be that funny to some, but I kind of say, well, if you have mommy issues or you have daddy issues, we've got a pacifier for each of you. Take your flavor, and either way. And just to clarify, what I mean by that is kind of the right, as I was saying, that the Hegelian right of this movement, they're operating through tends to be more of like the dark. Enlightenment, neo-reactionary types who are very authoritarian, the patriarchal kind of top-down structure. And then you have on the left, or operating through the left, I should say, the more spiritualists, the more they operate more on, at least ostensibly, I don't know that they're actually doing this, but they're coming from a place of very emotional feeling. The people like Barbara Marx Hubbard, who talk about the super sex and we're all going to be one and we all just love each other, kumbaya. So they're kind of operating from that, which, is the divine mother. And so just to clarify, but that's the joke I make. That they've got a pacifier for each of you. You take your choice of your comfort blanket. But either way, they're steering us towards this noosphere, which is fomenting the singularity. So if anybody wants to, take on that, what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that the transhumanist thing, if you think essentially what it boils down to, what all of this boils down to is controlling us. It's about controlling us, because quite evidently our behavior, what we do, and probably the things that we buy and where we spend our money, these things really matter.
Yeah.
So if you go back to what the original technocrats were talking about, they referred to us as the human animal. And they said that, we could be programmed like a machine. So we could be, taught what to eat, when to sleep, when to procreate, what not, certain ceremonies that we'd have to go through first before we would do even that. The whole, they assumed that we could be programmed. That was nailed into their ideology from the start. If you then go to things like the fourth industrial revolution, which we could say has kind of come from the book that Schwab wrote that comes from that kind of, we might say that comes from the traditional political kind of left of the political hemisphere, then that was this kind of Schwabian oligarchic network that was centered around the Club of Rome and people like Henry Kissinger and Eric Schmidt and that kind of oligarch network. Yeah. They, very much on board with the idea of convergence. Kissinger and Schmidt said that we could evolve into what they called Homo Technicus. So we would become this new kind of breed of human being that's kind of melded with technology, and we'll probably come on to talk about the singularity in a moment. But the idea being that we need to make this transition in order that we can cope with the inevitable impact of the singularity, which isn't inevitable at all, actually. Yeah, so the whole notion is based on us being as programmable as possible. So in order to control our behavior, which means that, that we can, the maximum amount of profit can be extracted from us, the maximum amount of control can be exerted. So if we look on the kind of traditional left of what we might call the globalist oligarch network, we've got people like Schwab and Schmidt and Kissinger and those kind of traditionally, and people like that. Well, they talk about us being turned into Homo technicus. And this notion that we have to meld with technology in order to become capable of resisting what they call the ravages of the singularity. And then on the other side of the political spectrum, and again, I think these notions are given to us. Even the things like the left-right divide of the political spectrum are given to us precisely to divide us and ensure that we're not focusing on the real problem. On the other side of that, you've got what we might call the kind of more right-leaning, they've been even labelled outright the kind of techno kings, the people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and those kind of people who flip-flop, noticeably flip-flop from both sides of the political spectrum, and who would cast themselves as libertarians, which they certainly are not. But if you look from what they're saying, then we have to be what they call technoplastic beings. So we can either be Homo technicus or we can be technoplastic beings. The point is that we have to accept the increasing intrusion of technology, not just into our lives, but into ourselves, and I think the concerning thing is, if you look at something like the uptake of the smartphone, and the increasing propensity of people to have digital wearables, and we're already seeing in places like Sweden people having chipping parties where they celebrate the fact that they've just had an RFID chip inserted in their bodies. We are adopting this quite enthusiastically in many cases without once considering what it would mean to have, for example, a chip inside your body that can certainly act as a transmitter, but also a receiver. So I think we really need to kind of step back a bit and think whether this is something that a path that we should even contemplate going down.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah. Then David, you want to add to that?
You mentioned the noosphere, which is an idea I think associated with Pierre de Teilhard de Chardin, a French thinker, and he wasn't alone in coming up with these kinds of ideas in the early to mid 20th century. And I was very interested while reading Jacob Nordangard's two books, Rockefeller Controlling the Game and The Global Coup d'etat, to see that there's a connection actually between these kinds of ideas and Rockefeller funding, and also dreams of connecting human consciousness to the internet, the cloud, brain-computer interfaces, and so on. These things actually go hand in hand. So what we've been talking about is an obvious affront against Christianity. And Patrick's written in his work about the way some of the modern technocrats are taken to the Burning Man festival. There's a strong kind of New Age flavor to a lot of this, which I think is non-accidental. And so one of the kind of bigger picture ideas that they have is that for whatever reason, human beings need to evolve supposedly beyond their current flawed state into something, I don't know, perhaps more godlike, or merging with AI, or approaching the singularity, or whatever it may be. And so actually this does take us quite deep into the realms of religion, and they're serious about this. And so, when you see Elon Musk in his Baphomet costume, and I think he left that image as his Twitter profile image for a good 6 months or so, they are telling us something here. So we need to keep an eye on that.
Or his rock emblem, which he claims is the event horizon but it strangely looks like Saturn. Right? So is that some sort of a nod, a signaling to the initiated? I don't know, but it's definitely curious. So, yeah. Patrick.
And then I think we should also consider that people like Peter Thiel and people at there's a movement that started up by a guy called Tan, who's from the Y Combinator Accelerator startup investment group that started a thing called Act 17 in the US, is that they're very much focused as well on rethinking Christian theology.
Yes.
They want to change that too.
Barbara Marx Hubbard took it upon herself to rewrite the New Testament. And she told her dear friend Bucky that, it just had to be done. He said he had the same vision. He was so proud of her. Bucky being Buckminster Fuller. So,
yeah.
Yes, indeed. By the way, there's some discussion, historically at least, that Fuller was not a technocrat.
Oh.
And I just absolutely can't handle that. I debunked that thought.
Thank you.
That
That's absurd.
Minister Fuller was a total technocrat, and he expressed it all over the place.
Yes, I would absolutely agree.
And I think that's a good point as well, because we are seeing people openly expressing now that they're nailing their technocrat, flag to the pole. They are, there are conversations that certainly Elon Musk has had on Twitter, where he was talking to a guy called, I'm not going to murder the pronouncement of this name, but Guillaume Verdon, who started a thing called the E Accelerator movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he Guillaume Verdon said something like, the network state is being rolled out on Mars. We might come to talk about that, the network state. Yeah. Elon Musk replied sort of enthusiastically, the Mars technocracy. And Guillaume Verdon goes, yeah, count me in. So that they are. Musk often talks about technocracy in terms of, he's openly said he wants Mars to be the Martian technate. Yeah. But of course he's not building a society on Mars. He's controlling the Trump administration, or not controlling, but he's highly influential in the Trump administration on Earth. So they are becoming quite bold, I think, and quite bold in asserting their desire for technocracy.
I have to mention here at this point that in the early 1970s, when the Trilateral Commission was being formed, in 73 in particular, there was hardly any mention from 73 to 76 about the Trilateral Commission. And when Jimmy Carter was elected then, they all came out of hiding all of a sudden. Carter and his Vice President Mondale, they were both members of the Trilateral Commission. Zbigniew Brzezinski was the first appointment that came in as National Security Advisor, co-founder. All of the people who joined the cabinet at that point were members of the Trilateral Commission, save one. And there were other people in the administration who were also members of the Trilateral Commission, maybe not at a cabinet level, but at the top. They were all visible for 4 years when basically they hijacked the economic engine of the world at that point in order to reform it. But by necessity, they had to be visible for a period of time. And so we were able to take shots at them at that point. And we did. Then they went underground, totally underground. You couldn't find anything about the Trilateral Commission during the Reagan years, the Bush years. Even though Bush was a member of the Trilateral Commission himself, you couldn't find hardly anything on it. And even in the Clinton years, they were both members of Trilateral Commission, Gore and Clinton themselves. But nevertheless, they never surfaced again. You had no group photos, if you will, to say there they are all together, and so they just hid. This was expressed in David Rockefeller's memoirs, how they were able to hide in plain sight all those years, and they're still hiding in plain sight right now. That is the Trilateral Commission members. They're still there. They're just not public. However, this technocrats class, it has also been hidden for all these years. You never saw the players along the way. All of a sudden, boom, with this administration, they came out of the woodwork to be public again.
Yep.
To me, this is a significant observation, because apparently they think they have the trump card. No pun intended.
Pun intended.
But they think they can win the whole thing right now. And if you look at their tools, for instance, what's going on with the AI especially, you have to consider maybe they really do have the trump card at this point to play on society globally. So anyway, that's my observation from the 70s to now. They're all appearing again at once.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd just like to just briefly say that when Trump shortly before the inauguration, I think it was shortly before the inauguration, when he announced these plans to, for example, take Greenland economically or militarily, and then seize the Panama Canal, and then, implying that therefore Central America would somehow come part of, this whole kind of notion that this map that he drew in words, and Patrick and I have spoken about this before, was notably, and I think the key thing is the inclusion of Greenland, because even things like the North American Union and NAFTA and things like that, Greenland wasn't included. Greenland was included in the Technocracy Inc.'s map of a North American technate, which was published, I think, on the reverse side of the original Technocracy Inc. study course.
Yeah.
So I'm not for 1 minute suggesting that is a geopolitical prospect in terms of, militarily or economically in that sense. But I do think it was a moment where, this kind of, little signal to the rest of the world, to the rest of the oligarchy, I would suggest, that the technocrats are in charge now. We are in charge of arguably, well, not arguably, the most powerful nation on earth.
Yeah, I think that's
exactly. I have to show you this. This is the Technocracy study course.
Oh,
the
wow.
book. This is the printed book that came out in 1934. And I have a copy of it, obviously, right here. That's the actual book. And that's the same picture that you showed before.
Yes.
Interestingly, several media outlets inadvertently searched Google, found that picture, and put it up, not having a clue where it came from. And how ignorant they are. They just had no clue that was the original specification for the North American technate.
Which it's very similar to the maps of that the Club of Rome, 1973, the regionalized adaptive globalization map that they did, right, with 10 blocks.
Yes.
That's a
same thing. Yeah.
Thing. Yeah.
There's no coincidences here, in my opinion. No.
Doesn't seem to be. No. So with I recently learned, I didn't realize how we were talking about the New Age movement, and I didn't realize that there's definitely a lot of funding from people like the Rockefellers, which are also funding this technocratic movement. But apparently the trilaterals were also very into this movement. And I'm noticing, since you brought up the network states, what I'm noticing is there is this like kind of, they're using what I would call kind of a false Christendom to lure people in. I've seen Peter Thiel does this. He, keeps saying he's a Christian. I don't know how that is commensurate, but with Christianity. But he's saying he's Christian, and I think it's to lend the credibility to the more traditional, quote unquote, conservatives, right? I think it's more of a marketing ploy. I've also recently seen, I've been diving into this Game B, which I do think is kind of the left-leaning kind of technocratic movement, although they claim that they're opposed to technocracy, which is very convenient, except they just all happen to be in the tech venture startup space. And a lot of them are disciples of Barbara Marx Hubbard, who I would argue was a transhumanist, but somehow they're opposed to technocracy. But now there is in that movement, Jordan Hall. Yeah, it's definitely Gnostic. The Stuart Brand in his 1968 Whole Earth magazine, right? He opened it saying, "We are gods. We might as well get good at it," and then he rebranded it, pun intended, in 2015. "We are gods. We better get good at it." This is on the wiki introduction to Game B, and there's now Jordan Hall did a conversion to Christianity a year ago. And I'm seeing a lot of this, right? We see a lot of popular media influencers who are doing this conversion. We are seeing, we have the Jordan Peterson's ARC, Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, which claims to be a counter to the World Economic Forum, but their funding is very conveniently directly linked to the World Economic Forum. I'm not sure how that all pans out, with Legatum and, that I did a whole video on that. So that for people who are interested in that financial trail, it's that they both tie to the same place. So it looks like a dialectical right-hand path, but they're using a lot of what I call Christianese as a veneer to lure people in who would be conservatives or more traditional. And now with Game B, Jordan Hall is a proponent of something called Civium, the Civium project. And to me, this is just a rebranding. I just put up on my Substack about the 15-minute city, smart city. We have Trump, who rebranded the 15-minute city, called it Freedom Cities, which sounds wonderful. Who doesn't want a freedom city? But the Civium project, I think, is a little bit more, in some ways, clever, because it's marketing to people who want to go off the grid, although they need the grid in order to be part of it. But at least they're going to be in nature and growing their own food. So there's the cosplay element of being off the grid. Not to say there's not value in actually being, growing your own food and being self-sufficient and actually engaging with nature and humanity. I'm not saying that, but it's a merging of these two, because you still need all the technology to be in the network state. So all of this, just as a backdrop I'm curious your thoughts on how they're using these movements. And particularly, I think right now, I'm just seeing a lot of, Christianity as a banner that's luring people in, thinking that this is very Christian, but I think it looks like a technological imagization of the eschaton, which is like the complete antithesis of Christianity. So, yeah, if anybody wants to address any of those things.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of trickery and deception involved at many levels. We should also talk about the so-called techno-populism,
Yes,
which the new Trump administration has been using to win support for measures which will be highly oppressive to the public, but packaging them and marketing them in a way to make them sound attractive. And I think the number of figures that you're referring to who have suddenly found Christianity is another way of winning people on board to this cause. But then you may find that their interpretation of Christianity is somewhat warped. For example, some of these venture capitalists who are now professing their Christianity at the same time have been developing weapons that have been used for terrible purposes in places like Gaza and the Ukraine. And there are some kind of mental backflips and somersaults that you can perform to try and reconcile this with Christianity. But my fear is that many people here are being led up the garden path, thinking that they are buying into something which is promoting liberty and promoting virtue and so on, and are actually thereby giving their consent to a Trump administration which has immediately surrounded itself with technocrats and is evidently working very hard and very fast to institute technocracy.
Yeah. There's an interesting phenomena where the technocrats surrounding Trump, maybe Peter Thiel is an example, or the odd man out, because he openly professes Catholicism. But, J.D. Vance is a Catholic also, converted Catholic.
Yeah.
But outside of that, most of these technocrats don't have any religious affiliation, especially with Christianity necessarily. However, there's been another group of people in this Trump administration who are decidedly religious, openly religious, who are interfacing with the populist movement. On the other side, technocrats over here, the religious people looking at the technocrats through a religious lens. That type of Christianity, however, is not biblical Christianity at all,
right,
but rather it's a type of it's a bastardization of Christianity, in my opinion, to promote nationalism and basically all the doctrines that Trump has expressed so far. And they're accepting of the technocrat crowd along the way. This has always puzzled me, how you can bond yourself to the technocrats who have a totally mechanistic worldview on everything, to the Christians who supposedly should have a biblical worldview, which totally rejects the mechanistic worldview in the first place. That doesn't make any sense at all. But this is exactly where we are in America, for sure.
Yeah.
At this point.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's going to be resolved at some point in time. I think it's going to be really messy, because this Christian element and the core of this is surrounding Trump himself.
Yes.
And these people are really unplugged, in my opinion. They're really unplugged from biblical Christianity, for sure. And they're espousing another type of a gospel outside of that. And by definition, it really becomes a cult.
Yes.
In the end, you have the cult of religion, you have the cult of personality, and then you have the cult of technocracy, all operating in the same sphere at the same time.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts, Ian, but I just want to add one thing to that. I think it's operational. I think that it's not biblically oriented. I think it's operational. So a lot of what you're seeing with this movement surrounding the Trump administration, who profess Christianity, are professing something that looks a lot more like a neo-integralist movement. And I think that is a very compatible, operationally speaking, with GovCorp, because there are people who romanticize things like a monarchical, divine king, which is very aligned with this kind of GovCorp kind of top-down authoritarian mindset, and certainly with the neo-reactionary movement. So I think that they're operationally aligned, not necessarily theologically or even philosophically aligned, but it does work hand in hand. And I'm not saying that everybody who's involved knows that, or they're fully aware, or they're even plugged in. But I do think that those who know understand that this is a good tactic for operational success. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that goes back, Courtney, to something that we were all talking about before we began. To what extent are these ideologies and philosophies that these people are touting? Certainly people like Peter Thiel, and I would argue that Peter Thiel is probably the most prominent